The Montana blizzard of 1885 descended like divine wrath, its howling winds carrying the promise of death across the frozen wilderness. Through the wall of driving snow, a figure stumbled toward the isolated cabin that stood defiant against winter's fury. Eli Booker pressed his weathered face to the frost-covered window, his rifle trembling in hands that had killed Sioux warriors and skinned grizzly bears with equal steadiness. She materialized from the white veil like a specter, a young woman, perhaps 21, her bare feet leaving crimson drops in the pristine snow. The threadbare dress clinging to her skeletal frame offered no protection against the killing cold, and her lips had turned the deep blue of approaching death. Dark hair whipped around a face so gaunt it seemed carved from bone, but it was what she clutched in her frozen fingers that made Eli's pulse stutter. A piece of torn cardboard with desperate words scrawled across it in a shaking hand. "Warm me?" The woman collapsed against his door with a sound like kindling snapping under an axe. Eli's instincts, honed through 3 decades of frontier violence, screamed danger. No one traveled this deep into the wilderness, especially not a barefoot woman in winter's most vicious tantrum. The nearest settlement lay 30 miles through mountain passes that claimed experienced trappers, even in fair weather. Yet as he watched her crumple against the rough-hewn logs, something deeper than suspicion stirred in his chest. A pain he'd buried 15 years ago beneath whiskey and self-imposed exile. The woman's age, the delicate bone structure visible beneath her suffering. It reminded him of another girl, one torn from his life when she was barely old enough to speak her own name. Charlotte, his daughter. The child who'd vanished in a raid that left his wife Sarah bleeding out in their dooryard while he was away on Army patrol tracking phantom war parties through the Badlands. He'd searched for 2 years, following every rumor and false lead, until the trail went stone cold, and the bottle became his only companion. When that nearly killed him too, he'd retreated to these mountains to die alone with his guilt. Instead, he'd learned to survive after a fashion. Eli set his rifle aside and threw open the door. Winter's breath immediately clawing at his sanctuary. The woman was unconscious, her breathing so shallow he had to press his ear to her chest to confirm life still flickered within. As he lifted her slight form, he was shocked by how little she weighed, barely more than a child, though her features showed the sharp angles of adulthood carved by prolonged suffering. "Lord, help us both," he muttered, kicking the door shut against the storm's assault. He carried her to the stone fireplace, where orange flames danced hungrily, laying her on the thick, bearskin rug he'd taken from a grizzly 3 winters past. Her skin felt like winter itself beneath his calloused palms. As Eli began peeling away the frozen fabric from her limbs, his jaw tightened with recognition, born from years reading violence's signature. Fresh rope burns circled both wrists like crimson bracelets, the flesh raw and weeping. Someone had bound this woman recently. The marks were too fresh to be more than hours old. The torn dress bore stains he recognized from his Army days' blood, both old and new, telling a story of prolonged captivity and recent escape. But it was her hands that made him pause. Despite the trauma and starvation, they were well-formed with long fingers that spoke of gentle upbringing. These weren't the hands of a common criminal or truly insane person. They belonged to someone who'd been raised with care before whatever hell she'd endured. The woman's eyes fluttered open, pale green like spring grass, after rain filled with terror so profound it made him step back instinctively. She tried to speak, but only a harsh whisper emerged from her damaged throat. Her gaze darted around the cabin with the hypervigilance of prey that had learned to fear every shadow. "Easy now." Eli said, his voice rusty from months of speaking only to his horses. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you." She stared at him with those haunting eyes, and he saw something flicker across her features, not just fear, but a strange recognition, as if she knew him from somewhere beyond memory. The look lasted only a moment before pain and exhaustion dragged her back toward unconsciousness. Eli built up the fire and wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then set about preparing hot broth from dried venison and wild herbs. As the liquid warmed, he examined the cardboard sign more carefully. The handwriting was shaky, but intelligent, formed by someone with education despite their obvious desperation. On impulse, he flipped it over. His blood turned to ice water. Stamped in faded blue ink was a mark that made his hands shake. Property of Fort Resolute Asylum. Below that, someone had scribbled a number in pencil, Patient 447, Fort Resolute. The asylum had burned to the ground 2 weeks ago in a fire that killed 30 people. The territorial newspapers had called it a tragedy, but there had been whispers in the saloons talk of financial troubles, patients being mistreated, records deliberately destroyed. The timing coincided with rumors about the institution's corrupt practices, making Eli wonder if the fire had been anything but accidental. He studied the woman again, noting the rope burns, the torn dress, the terror that went deeper than madness. She hadn't been a patient at all. She'd been a prisoner. Dawn came gray and bitter, the blizzard finally spent, but leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of crystalline silence. The woman stirred as pale light filtered through the windows, those green eyes immediately alert, despite her obvious weakness. When she saw him sitting nearby with his rifle across his knees, she didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded once, a gesture of gratitude that somehow conveyed more than words could. "How are you feeling?" Eli asked gently. She opened her mouth, but again, only a hoarse whisper emerged, followed by a grimace of frustration. Her hand moved to her throat, and she made a cutting gesture. The meaning was clear. Something had stolen her voice, whether trauma or deliberate injury. Eli brought her paper and pencil from his desk, precious supplies in this remote place. She took them eagerly, her hand steadier now that warmth had returned to her fingers. In careful block letters, she wrote, "Thank you for saving me." "You're welcome," he said. "What's your name?" She hesitated, pencil hovering over the paper. Then, "They called me 447. Can't remember everything before." "That's not a name," Eli said firmly. "That's what they used to steal who you are." Something flickered in her eyes, hope maybe, or the first stirring of defiance. She wrote again, fragments come back. Pieces of before. Like what? A woman's voice singing, strong hands lifting me, smell of leather and horses. Eli's chest tightened. Those fragments could describe any frontier childhood, but something about the way she wrote them and the wistful precision of the details resonated with memories he'd tried to bury. They put me there to hide something. She continued writing, her hand moving faster now. Someone didn't want me to remember who I was. Remember what? The truth about my family. About why they died. Before Eli could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning stillness. 2 riders were pushing through the snowdrifts, their horses laboring against the deep powder. The woman heard them too and immediately pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that spoke of recent brutal experience. Eli grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. The men were rough-looking characters in long coats, both armed with revolvers and repeating rifles. They had the hard edges of professional killer's men who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. "Miss," one of them called out as they dismounted. "We know you're in there. We're here to help you." But the woman was already shaking her head frantically, pointing at the men and drawing her finger across her throat. Whatever these men represented, it meant death to her. The larger of the 2 approached the cabin with his hand resting on his gun butt. His companion stayed mounted, rifle ready. They moved with practiced coordination, veterans of this kind of work. Not names Deputy Marshal Kane. The first man announced, though Eli noticed he wore no badge visible through his coat. "We're tracking a dangerous patient who escaped during the Fort Resolute fire. Young woman, early 20s, mentally unstable and violent. We have reason to believe she's taken refuge here." Eli cracked the door, but kept his rifle visible. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description." Kane's eyes were winter cold, calculating. "This woman has already killed 2 people, mister. She's not the helpless victim she appears to be. Asylum records show a history of violent episodes attacks on staff and other patients. Behind him, the woman was writing frantically, "Lies. They killed staff members. I saw them do it. My land, my rules." Eli said flatly, "I don't let armed strangers inside, especially ones who show up making accusations without proper identification." "How'd you even find this place?" he added, studying Kane's face for tells. "Storm would have covered any tracks hours ago." Kane's eyes shifted slightly, the subtle tell of a man caught in deception. "We're experienced trackers. Followed the blood trail from where she collapsed in the woods. It was complete fabrication. The blizzard had erased any sign of the woman's passage, and there'd been no blood trail to follow. Eli had checked when he brought her inside. These men were fishing, hoping to intimidate him into cooperation." "Well, you tracked wrong," Eli replied. "Nobody here but me and my solitude." Kane's hand drifted closer to his weapon. "I'm afraid I'll have to insist on searching the premises. This is official territorial business." "Then show me your warrant and your badge," Eli countered. "Real marshals carry proper documentation, not just good intentions and hard talk." The two men exchanged glances, and Eli caught the subtle signals of professionals adjusting their plan. The mounted man shifted position to cover a different angle, while Kane stepped closer to threaten the door. "You're harboring a dangerous fugitive," Kane said, dropping all pretense of courtesy. "That makes you an accessory to murder. Now step aside before this situation becomes uglier than necessary." Eli let the rifle barrel drift toward the doorway. "Already ugly, friend. Two armed men threatening a citizen on his own property without proper authority, that's what I call genuinely ugly. Last warning, old man." "Same to you," Eli replied and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Immediately, he heard them moving, splitting up to surround the cabin. The woman had crawled to the window and was peering through a gap in the shutters. She held up 3 fingers, then made a circling motion with her hand. More men positioning themselves around the building. They'd walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. "Back room," Eli whispered, leading her to his bedroom where a heavy chest sat beneath the window. Moving it aside revealed a hidden panel he'd built years ago, a bolt hole that led to the root cellar beneath the cabin. "Can you climb down?" She nodded, understanding immediately. As she disappeared into the darkness below, Eli heard glass breaking in the front room. They were coming through the windows now, abandoning subtlety for direct assault. He grabbed ammunition and his spare rifle, then followed her down into the cramped cellar. The space was filled with preserved goods and emergency supplies, but more importantly, it connected to a tunnel that emerged behind the cabin, concealed by carefully arranged brush and fallen timber. "Can't stay here," he whispered as boots thundered overhead. "They'll search every corner." She pressed close to him in the darkness, and he could feel her trembling, not from cold now, but from pure terror. Whatever these men represented, it was worse than death to her. They crawled through the tunnel as voices shouted above, emerging into the pine grove 50 yards behind the cabin. Through the trees, they could see the men methodically tearing his home apart, looking for any sign of her presence. The woman tugged on his sleeve and pointed to the paper she'd brought. In the growing daylight, he could read her earlier writing, but she'd added more during their time below. "Uncle sold me to Asylum for my inheritance." Eli's pulse quickened. "What inheritance?" "Land rights. Mineral claims. Worth fortune when I turned 21. "Who's your uncle?" She hesitated, then wrote a name that made his blood freeze. Amos Virel. Amos Virel owned half the territory, had his fingers in every business, from copper mines to cattle ranches. If Virel wanted someone dead, local law wouldn't lift a finger to prevent it. But more than that, the name stirred something in Eli's memory, a connection he couldn't quite grasp. "He killed my mother to steal the rights," she continued, writing, her hand shaking now. "Raised me under false name to hide the murder." "What was your mother's name?" The woman's hand trembled as she wrote, "Sarah." The world tilted sideways. Sarah was his wife's name, but that was impossible. Sarah had died 15 years ago, killed by raiders who'd stolen their daughter. Unless Sarah Booker, the woman added, watching his face intently for recognition. The pencil fell from Eli's numb fingers. Sarah Booker. His Sarah, his wife, murdered in what everyone believed was a random raid. But this woman was claiming it had been planned murder, orchestrated by family, by Sarah's own brother. She was studying his reaction with those green eyes, seeing the recognition dawn like sunrise over mountains. Her hand moved to touch his weathered cheek with gentle fingers, and he saw tears streaming down her face. "I think I'm Charlotte," she wrote in shaking letters. "Your daughter." The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Charlotte. His little girl, stolen 15 years ago when she was barely old enough to remember her own name. He stared at her face, really looking for the first time past the suffering and starvation, and saw it, the bone structure, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her head when concentrating. Features he'd memorized from a faded daguerreotype he still carried. Charlotte. His voice broke on the name. "My little girl." She nodded, fresh tears falling like spring rain. Then she wrote furiously, the words tumbling out in desperate script. Raiders worked for Amos. He wanted Mother dead. She wouldn't sell mineral rights. Took me to hide the crime. Raised me with false memories. Eli's hands shook as he read. The raid hadn't been random frontier violence at all. It had been cold-blooded murder designed to eliminate his wife and steal their daughter. Amos Varel, Sarah's own brother, had orchestrated the entire tragedy. Couldn't speak after trauma. He used my silence to control me. When I started remembering, he had me committed. Why now? Eli whispered, his throat tight with 15 years of buried grief. Why put you away now? Turning 21. Next month. Could legally claim inheritance. Amos, drowning in gambling debts, needs my rights to survive. Of course. The mineral rights Sarah had inherited from her family were worth a fortune now, with the territory's mining boom in full swing. Rights that would legally transfer to Charlotte on her 21st birthday, ending Amos's fraudulent control forever. Planned to kill me in Asylum fire. Made it look like accident. But you escaped. Sympathetic guard helped. He died in the flames saving others. Charlotte's face crumpled with survivor's guilt. Someone had died helping her, and that weight would follow her always. How did you survive out there for 2 weeks? Eli asked, marveling at the strength it must have taken. Stole food from supply wagons. Found abandoned trapper shelters. Nearly froze dozen times. That explained her condition, the malnutrition, the frostbite, the exhaustion. She'd survived in wilderness that killed experienced frontiersmen driven by nothing but the desperate need to reach safety. A shout from the cabin interrupted them. The men had finished their search and were coming outside, spreading out to look for tracks in the snow. We need help, Eli whispered. Someone in authority who isn't on Varel's payroll. Charlotte shook her head sadly and wrote, He owns judges, sheriffs, newspaper editors. Corruption everywhere. Not everyone, Eli said grimly. I sent letters to the territorial marshal's office weeks ago after hearing rumors about asylum conditions. If they're investigating. Charlotte's eyes widened with hope. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. Younger than Kane's, more educated with the cultured tones of someone accustomed to authority. Clara, I know you're out there and I know you're frightened. Charlotte went rigid with terror, pressing herself against Eli's side like a cornered animal. She wrote quickly, Jacob, Amos's son. Clara, it's your brother Jacob. The voice continued, using a name that wasn't Charlotte's. Uncle Jacob loves you, even when you're having these episodes. Come home so we can take proper care of you. Charlotte's response was barely a whisper, and the first words Eli had heard her speak clearly, not my name. Her voice was hoarse and broken, but hearing it filled him with fierce joy. His daughter was finding her way back to herself one word at a time. "I know you're confused, Clara." Jacob called his tone patient and reasonable. "The delusions seem very real to you, but they're symptoms of your condition. Father's worried sick about you. He's lying." Charlotte whispered, her voice gaining strength. "Everything, he says, is lies." Jacob's voice moved closer. "The old man with you is filling your head with fantasies, Clara. Stories about mysterious murders and stolen inheritances. But we both know the truth. You were orphaned young, and Father saved you from poverty and disease." "We need to move," Eli said quietly. "He's got men positioned all around us." He remembered a cave system from his hunting days, carved into the mountainside by ancient waters. It would provide shelter and possibly multiple escape routes if they could reach it. "Can you walk?" Charlotte nodded weakly, though he could see the effort it cost her. The 2 weeks of survival had pushed her to the absolute limit of endurance. They made their way deeper into the forest, following game trails that wound between towering pines. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Men calling to each other, organizing a systematic search. "Clara." Jacob's voice echoed through the trees. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Father's dead. Clara died of a heart attack when he learned you'd escaped. There's no one left to hurt you now." Charlotte stumbled and Eli caught her arm. "He's lying?" he asked. "Has to be," she whispered. "Amos wouldn't die so easily." But there had been something in Jacob's voice, genuine grief mixed with desperation. Maybe the old man really had died, leaving his son to handle the consequences of 15 years of crime. The cave mouth was hidden behind a curtain of icicles barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Inside, the space opened into a natural chamber carved from limestone. The air was cold, but still protected from the biting wind that cut through the forest. As Eli built a small fire from dry wood, left by previous occupants, Charlotte explored the cave with returning strength. The warmth and shelter were reviving her, and she moved with more confidence now, no longer the broken wraith who'd collapsed at his door. "Tell me more about the years between," Eli said as flames caught the kindling. "What was it like living with him?" Charlotte's voice was stronger now, though still barely above a whisper. "Luxury on the surface. Beautiful clothes, finest tutors, every comfort money could buy. But underneath, constant fear. He controlled everything, what I read, who I spoke to, where I could go." She sat beside him, sharing the fire's warmth. "Told me my parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 5. Said he saved me from poverty and disease. I believed him because what choice did I have? I was just a child." "When did you start remembering the truth?" Fragments came back slowly over the years. Dreams, mostly. A woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of leather and horses. But I dismissed them as fantasies until... She reached into her dress and pulled out a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. "Until I found this." Inside the cloth was a gold locket tarnished with age, but still beautiful. Charlotte opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a tiny photograph of a young man in an army uniform, Eli himself decades younger. "Where did you get that?" he breathed, recognizing Sarah's most treasured possession. "Mother pressed it into my hand the day she died," Charlotte whispered. "I hid it all these years, kept it sewn into my dress. When I finally looked at the photograph closely, I recognized your face from my dreams." Eli's vision blurred with tears. Sarah had worn that locket every day of their marriage, claiming it kept him close when duty took him away. The fact that she'd given it to Charlotte in her final moments, that their daughter had kept it safe through 15 years of captivity. "That's when you knew who you really were." "That's when I started asking dangerous questions," Charlotte corrected. I searched Amos's study and found letters correspondence between him and the men who killed Mother. He kept them in his safe, like trophies. Her voice grew stronger with anger. The letters detailed everything. How he'd arranged the raid to look like hostile Indians. How he'd planned to blame it on territorial conflicts. How he intended to forge documents claiming Mother's inheritance. Why didn't he just kill you too? Because he needed me alive to legitimize his claim to the mineral rights. As my legal guardian, he could control them until I came of age. But when I started questioning the story he'd told me when I found evidence of his crimes, he had you committed. Bribed doctors to declare me insane. Paid guards to keep me isolated, drugged, broken. The plan was to let me die in the Asylum fire, making him my sole heir, with no witnesses left alive. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists. But there was one decent man there, Dr. Webb. He'd been investigating the corruption, gathering evidence of what was really happening to certain patients. Webb helped you escape. He got me out through a service tunnel just before the fire started. Gave me these. She pulled a small bundle from her dress, folded papers covered in cramped handwriting. Copies of records, correspondence, financial documents. Proof of everything. Eli examined the papers by firelight. Names, dates, amounts of money changing hands, a meticulous record of corruption that reached into every level of territorial government. Webb didn't die in the fire. I don't know, Charlotte said quietly. He went back for more evidence, said someone had to survive to tell the truth. I pray he made it out. Outside the cave, snow began falling again, not the violent blizzard of before, but steady flakes that would cover their tracks while also trapping them in the mountains. They were safe for now, but Jacob's men would keep searching. He'll never give up, Charlotte said, reading Eli's thoughts. Too much depends on silencing me permanently. Jacob believes he's protecting his family. Jacob believes whatever Amos told him, Charlotte replied. He thinks I'm his beloved adopted sister who's tragically gone insane. In his mind, he's being merciful by trying to return me to medical care. Even though he's hunting you with killers, he thinks he's saving me from a worse fate, she said sadly. Amos was very good at making people believe his version of reality. I spent years doubting my own memories because of his manipulation. As if summoned by her words, voices echoed from outside the cave, closer than before, and growing nearer with each passing moment. Found tracks leading this way, someone called. Fresh prints in the snow. Eli checked his rifle and moved toward the entrance. Through the icicles, he could see figures moving through the trees, methodically searching every possible hiding place. How many men does Jacob have with him? He whispered. Too many. Charlotte replied, her voice tight with fear. And they know these mountains as well as we do. The voices were almost at the cave mouth now. Discovery was inevitable. Miss Charlotte. Came Jacob's cultured voice, very close now. I know you're frightened and confused, but this has gone far enough. Come out peacefully, and we can resolve this like civilized people. Charlotte pressed against the cave wall, shaking her head silently. You're my sister, Charlotte. Jacob continued, dropping the false name for the first time. I love you, even when you're having these episodes. But I can't let you hurt yourself or others with these violent fantasies. They're not fantasies, Charlotte whispered, finding her voice again. I know what your father did. What father supposedly did. Jacob corrected, appearing at the cave entrance with his hands raised to show he carried no visible weapons. According to the paranoid delusions of a seriously disturbed mind. Clara, you need medical help, not whatever this man is filling your head with. He was tall and lean, with intelligent eyes and his father's calculating manner. But there was something else there too, what looked like genuine concern mixed with desperate confusion. Hello, sister, he said softly, stepping into the cave. You look terrible. When's the last time you had a proper meal? I'm not your sister. Charlotte replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. My name is Charlotte Booker, and your father murdered my mother. Jacob's expression didn't change. Your name is Charlotte Varel, and you've been suffering from severe delusions since childhood. The trauma of losing your parents in that cholera outbreak damaged your mind in ways we're only beginning to understand. There was no cholera outbreak, Charlotte said firmly. There was a planned raid organized by Amos to steal mineral rights that belonged to my family. Show me proof. Jacob challenged, though something flickered in his eyes. Real evidence, not the paranoid fantasies of a disturbed mind. Charlotte held up the bundle of papers she'd gotten from Dr. Webb. Letters in your father's handwriting, financial records, correspondence with the men who carried out the murder. Jacob's composure cracked slightly as he recognized the documents. Where did you get those? From his safe where he kept them as trophies, evidence of what he'd accomplished. Even if those papers were authentic, Jacob said desperately, they could have been forged by your accomplices. Clara, you've been manipulated by people who want to use your condition for their own gain. For a moment, doubt flickered across Charlotte's face. 15 years of gaslighting had trained her to question her own perceptions, to defer to authority figures who claimed to know better. But then her hand found the locket at her throat and her resolve hardened. I have this, she said, pulling out the tarnished gold pendant. My mother's locket with my father's photograph inside. She gave it to me the day she died, and I've carried it ever since. Jacob stared at the locket, his face going pale. That's impossible. Father told me you were an orphan when he took you in. Your father was a liar and a murderer. Eli said, speaking for the first time. And if you're not careful, you'll end up just like him. Jacob's gaze shifted to Eli, really seeing him for the first time. Recognition dawned slowly then, understanding that made his face go ashen. You're Eli Booker, he said quietly. The Army Scout. Charlotte's father, Eli replied firmly. That would mean... Jacob's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. If Charlotte really was Eli Booker's daughter, if she really had been kidnapped rather than orphaned, then everything his father had told him was a lie. It means your father built his empire on murder and theft, Eli said. And you've been helping him cover it up. No, Jacob said, but his voice was shaking now. Father saved Charlotte from poverty. He gave her everything: education, refinement, a place in society. He gave her trauma and nightmares, Charlotte said quietly. He stole my childhood, my identity, my voice. For 15 years I couldn't speak because of what he did to me. But you're speaking now, Jacob pointed out, desperately grasping for any contradiction. Because I'm home, Charlotte replied, moving closer to Eli. Because I finally remember who I really am. Jacob stared at them both, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling. Then his face hardened with desperate resolve. Even if any of that were true. He said, it doesn't matter now. Too much depends on the Varel family maintaining control. Too many people would be hurt if our business interests collapsed. So you'll commit murder to protect profits? Eli asked. I'll do whatever's necessary to protect what we've built, Jacob replied. He gestured toward the cave entrance, where armed men waited in the shadows. Charlotte can have a comfortable life in a private facility. Medical care, pleasant surroundings, no responsibilities or stress. It's more merciful than what she'd face trying to manage a fortune in her condition. Charlotte's answer was to step protectively behind Eli, her choice clear. Jacob sighed with what sounded like genuine regret. I'm sorry it has to be this way. I truly did love you as a sister. The attack erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Jacob dove for cover as his men opened fire, filling the cave with deafening gunshots and ricocheting bullets that sparked off limestone walls. Eli returned fire methodically, making each shot count while Charlotte pressed herself against the far wall. The confined space initially worked in their favor. The attackers couldn't use their superior numbers effectively, and Eli's knowledge of the cave's layout gave him advantage. But ammunition was limited, and Jacob's men were seasoned professionals who knew how to sustain an assault. "Give it up, Booker," Jacob called over the gunfire. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. This can only end one way." "Could have said the same thing at Little Bighorn," Eli replied, chambering another round. Didn't stop those boys from making their mark. A bullet whined past his ear, chipping stone inches from his head. The shooters were getting bolder, pressing closer with each volley. His ammunition was running dangerously low. "There's another chamber deeper in," Charlotte shouted over the noise, pointing toward a narrow crack in the rear wall. "I saw it earlier might lead to another exit." Eli nodded, laying down covering fire as she squeezed through the opening. The passage was barely wide enough for a person forcing their pursuers to come single file if they wanted to follow. As he squeezed through after her, a bullet struck the stone where his head had been a second before. Too close. His old war wound from a Sioux arrow was throbbing now, slowing him down more than he'd like to admit. The passage opened into a smaller chamber that stretched back into absolute darkness. The sound of running water echoed from somewhere ahead, an underground stream possibly flowing toward the outside world. "This way," Charlotte whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as Jacob's men struggled to navigate the tight passage. They were buying precious time, but at what cost? The stream led them through a maze of natural tunnels, sometimes wide enough to walk upright, other times forcing them to crawl through spaces barely large enough for their bodies. Charlotte moved with surprising confidence, despite her earlier weakness, driven by desperation and returning strength. "How do you know where you're going?" Eli asked during a brief rest. "I don't," she admitted. "But Dr. Webb taught me something important. When you're trapped with no good options, keep moving forward. Sometimes the only way out is through." The passage began sloping upward, and fresh air stirred around them, a breeze that spoke of openings ahead. Light appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they climbed. They emerged onto a ledge overlooking a valley they didn't recognize miles from where they'd entered the cave system. The afternoon sun felt like a blessing after hours in the darkness. But their relief was short-lived. Down in the valley, riders were approaching more of Jacob's men positioned to cut off escape routes. But as the new group drew closer, Eli noticed something different about their formation, their uniforms. Territorial marshals. He breathed, recognizing the distinctive badges even at this distance. Charlotte gripped his arm. "Are you certain? What if Jacob got to them first?" It was a valid fear. Jacob was educated, well-dressed, from a prominent family. They were fugitives hiding in caves with only their word to support their incredible claims. "Then we tell the truth and pray it's enough," Eli said. The two groups of riders converged in the valley below, and even at this distance, they could see heated discussion taking place. Jacob was gesticulating wildly, pointing toward the mountains where they hid. The marshals seemed to be listening, but their body language suggested skepticism. Then one of the marshals, a man with silver hair and the bearing of authority, began climbing toward their position, leaving his men to keep Jacob's riders under close watch. "U.S. Marshal Tom Bradley," the man called when he was within earshot. "You folks seem to be in considerable trouble." Eli and Charlotte exchanged glances. This was the moment of truth, their word against Jacob's, with everything depending on which story the law believed. "Marshal." Eli called back, "My name is Eli Booker. This is my daughter Charlotte. We have quite a story to tell you." Bradley climbed the rest of the way to their ledge, studying them both with experienced eyes that had seen every form of human deception. "I imagine you do," he said carefully. "Been investigating the Fort Resolute fire for weeks now. Turns out it wasn't the accident everyone thought. Charlotte's knees nearly buckled with relief. Dr. Marcus Webb survived. Bradley continued noting their reaction. Made it out with a substantial cache of evidence that makes for very interesting reading. Financial records correspondence documented bribes. Quite the conspiracy. He looked directly at Charlotte. You must be patient 447. Dr. Webb told us all about you and about the man who had you illegally committed. My name is Charlotte Booker, she said firmly, her voice strong and clear. I know. Bradley smiled grimly. Dr. Webb confirmed your real identity. Amazing what a man will confess when he thinks he's about to die in a fire. Turns out your uncle Amos Farrell had quite the operation going corrupt. Doctors forged commitment papers, patients who conveniently died before they could cause problems. Where is Amos now? Charlotte asked. Dead, Bradley said simply. Heart attack yesterday when he learned we were closing in. Left his son Jacob to face the music alone, though the boy doesn't seem to understand the situation he's in. Down in the valley, Jacob was still arguing with the remaining marshals, his voice carrying across the distance, though the words were unclear. What about Dr. Webb? Charlotte asked anxiously. Is he safe? Safe and recovering in Helena, Bradley assured her. Burns on his hands and arms from going back for evidence, but he'll live. Said to tell you that your message helped save his life. Charlotte looked confused. What message? Something about a locket with hidden compartments, said you'd shown him how to use it to pass coded messages, helped him coordinate with Asylum staff who wanted to expose the corruption. Charlotte's hand went to her throat, touching the gold pendant. I did scratch marks inside the locket. Thought it might help if anyone found it after I was dead. Eli stared at her. You never mentioned that, because I wasn't sure it mattered, Charlotte said quietly. I thought I was going to die in that fire. The scratches were just a last desperate hope that someone would understand what had happened to me. Well, it worked, Bradley said. Dr. Webb recognized the marks as a crude but effective code. Helped him identify which staff members could be trusted, plan the escape route, gather evidence. Your ingenuity probably saved dozens of lives. There would be more to discuss, more details to uncover, but for now, it was enough. The truth was finally coming out. And they weren't alone anymore. There'll be trials, Bradley warned as they prepared to descend to the valley. Testimony needed evidence to be presented. It won't be easy reliving all this in public. We'll do whatever it takes, Eli said firmly, Charlotte nodding beside him. As they walked down to join the marshals, Charlotte surprised everyone by calling out to Jacob, who was now in handcuffs and looking utterly defeated. Jacob. He looked up, his face a mask of confusion and loss. I forgive you, Charlotte said clearly, her voice carrying across the valley. You were his victim too in your own way. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what you've done. Jacob stared at her, and for a moment his composure cracked completely. Clara, Charlotte, I don't understand any of this anymore. That's the first honest thing you've said. Charlotte replied sadly. Maybe now you can start learning the truth. It was closure of a sort, not the vengeful satisfaction of seeing enemies destroyed, but the peaceful resolution that came from choosing mercy over hatred. The trials stretched through spring and into early summer, becoming the most sensational legal proceedings in territorial history. Charlotte testified with growing confidence, her voice stronger each day, as she reclaimed her identity. Dr. Webb's evidence proved devastating to what remained of the Varel organization, exposing corruption that reached into every level of government. Jacob was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, harsh punishment, but not the death penalty he might have faced. His cooperation in exposing his father's other victims had earned him some consideration from the court. Charlotte's inheritance was restored in full, making her one of the wealthiest women in Montana Territory. But more importantly, she was free to choose her own path, her own identity, her own future. They rebuilt the cabin together, creating a home large enough for both of them, but intimate enough to foster the family connection they'd lost. Charlotte had learned practical skills during her captivity, and she put them to good use as they established a working ranch on their reclaimed land. The nightmares came less frequently now. Charlotte still sometimes woke, gasping in the dark, reliving trauma that couldn't be completely erased. But Eli was always there, and gradually genuine healing began to replace mere survival. They spent long evenings on the porch of their new home, talking about the lost years and building fresh memories to replace what had been stolen. Charlotte's voice had returned fully rich and musical like her mother's, and she used it to sing the songs Sarah had loved. One warm evening in late June, as fireflies danced in the valley below, and the last light faded from the western peaks, Charlotte pulled out her mother's locket and opened it to reveal Eli's young face, smiling back at them. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, her voice steady but serious. Eli waited, having learned to let her work through difficult revelations at her own pace. "I lied about this locket," she said, running her fingers over the worn gold surface. "Not about Mother giving it to me, but about how I used it during those years." She opened the pendant and showed him the inside of the lid, where tiny scratches were barely visible in the lamplight. "I told the marshal that I scratched these as a last message. But that wasn't the whole truth." Eli leaned closer, studying the marks. They were too deliberate to be random damage, too organized to be meaningless. When I started remembering who I was when I found those letters in Amos's safe, I knew I needed help. But everyone around me was either paid off or too frightened to act. So I used this locket to create a code, a way to communicate with Dr. Webb without arousing suspicion. How? I would accidentally drop it during our sessions or ask him to help me with the clasp. Each time I'd add a mark or change the pattern. Simple messages at first, "help me," or "not insane," but eventually more complex information about what Amos was planning. Eli felt a surge of pride at his daughter's ingenuity. That's how Webb knew about the fire in advance, and how he knew which patients were there illegally, which staff members could be trusted when Amos was visiting to check on his investments. Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she spoke. The locket became our lifeline, the only way truth could survive in that terrible place. She closed the pendant and looked directly into her father's eyes. "But there's more. The night before the fire, when I knew escape was my only chance, I almost used this chain for something else." Eli's stomach twisted as he understood her meaning. "I sat alone in that cell holding this locket, thinking about ending the pain permanently. It would have been easy to tie the chain around my neck, let the weight of despair finally win. But then I looked at your photograph and I realized something." Her voice was steady now, filled with quiet strength. "I realized that choosing to live was the ultimate victory over Amos. Every day I survived was proof that love was stronger than hate, that truth was more powerful than lies. This locket didn't just carry your image. It carried the promise that somewhere in the world, someone had loved me unconditionally." Tears ran freely down her cheeks, but her voice never wavered. "When I found you again, when I saw that you were real and not just a dream, I needed to know something. I needed to know if you could love the woman I'd become, not just mourn the child you'd lost. And now you know." Charlotte smiled through her tears, fastening the locket around her neck where it belonged. "Now I know that love isn't about perfection or about recovering what was lost. It's about choosing each other again and again, despite the scars and the pain and all the years we can never get back." Eli pulled her close, marveling at the strength of this remarkable woman who'd survived 15 years of hell and emerged with her capacity for love not just intact, but stronger than ever. "When you testified at Jacob's sentencing, he said, when you spoke about forgiveness in front of all those people, that took more courage than anything I did in all my years as a soldier. I learned something in that asylum, Charlotte replied. Hatred is a poison that destroys the vessel that contains it. I'd already lost 15 years to Amos's evil. I wasn't going to lose the rest of my life to bitterness. In the distance, a mockingbird began its evening song, cycling through melodies borrowed from other birds, but woven into something entirely new. Like Charlotte herself, it had learned to create beauty from fragments of what came before, building something unique while honoring the past. "I'm home," she said, simply leaning against her father's shoulder as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Yes." Eli agreed, watching the first stars appear over their valley, their land, their legacy, their future. "You're home." The harsh winter of their separation had ended forever. Spring had come to stay, bringing with it the promise of new growth, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a father and the daughter who'd found her way back to him against all odds. The door to their tragic past was finally closed. The door to their hopeful future stood wide open, and they would walk through it together.